Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of the new Suicide Squad movie, which was actually surprisingly very good, with a lot of comedy, a lot of entertaining action scenes, a lot of science fiction ideas, and even a lot of emotional scenes. It actually had some heart in the movie, and all the actors were great, and the special effects were excellent, and it had a bunch of gory, bloody stuff, but in a very fun and entertaining and artistic way. So it reminded me of why I used to love stuff like that in the past. In the past, I loved the horror movies because they were kind of interesting and artistic and funny and entertaining, not taking themselves too seriously. So it wasn't like psychologically difficult to watch. It was more funny to watch, and the practical special effects and all of that, which you can tell was not perfect, and so it was even more entertaining that way and less kind of horrific. And yet, in more modern movies, they kind of became more and more horrific, and just in a nasty way, just in a sadistic way, becoming like graphic porn almost. Like you want to enjoy watching people suffer, and it became psychologically difficult with abusing people and all of that. So I kind of fell out of love with horror movies in more recent years. I kind of stopped watching them almost. Like once in a while I watch some movie, and sometimes it is a very good movie, even if it's psychologically difficult. But still, it's not as fun as I remember it from back in the 90s and all of that. And yet this movie reminded me why I used to love all that kind of stuff, because the way they did it in this movie was much more entertaining. First of all, because the movie is comedic, so it can do this crazy over-the-top stuff, and it's not too serious, so you're not, feeling bad for the victims and all of that. Because it's all just for fun, and the way they do the special effects is interesting. That was also part of why I used to love, graphic special effects and all of that. It was just interesting. Like, what would happen if you do this to the human body or that to the human body? It's kind of interesting in a science fiction kind of way. So that's part of it, and also it was often artistic, just the way it looks like, even if it's horrific, it can still be done kind of a visually interesting way. Also on the practical level of just you wondering how the hell did they even film that, how did they do that special effect, that's interesting. And also just artistically the way it looks like, even if it's all bloody and all of that. Even in computer games, I remember I loved that. Back when I played even games like Fallout, you had the option of killing people with gory mess, and so I remember when I discovered that, I had to replay the game. The first time I played it, it was without that option. People just died simply. And then I discovered the option of seeing the gory mess, and then I had to go back and play the whole game again because I wanted to see all possible ways to kill people, like the way they explode and all of that. It was just interesting to see that, and kind of funny often and all of that. And so that's why I used to love that. It's not because I'm sadistic, but more because it's just scientifically interesting and artistically interesting. So in this movie, they actually had a bunch of scenes of people dying in interesting ways and artistic ways. They even kind of slow it down sometimes to have some kind of interesting shot, someone tearing someone in half or stuff like that, or someone's head being severed and yet his eyes are still moving because I guess he's still conscious. So all of that kind of stuff, it's kind of nasty, but in a good way. It's done in a funny way, in an interesting way, and artistic way. So this reminded me of why I used to love that kind of stuff, because it was done so well in this movie. And because it was so comedic. That's probably the main reason why I love this movie, because it actually made me laugh in a lot of places. They had some really good jokes, and the characters were all fun to watch. Some of them were kind of a little bit too silly, and when I first started the movie I didn't like that, but it kind of grew on me and I did become a fan of that, like the shark guy and all of that. That was kind of too out there. It was kind of too silly for me, even for a comedy movie. Just I couldn't get into it. But then later I was able to, and only after I watched the movie I discovered the shark guy was actually voiced by Stallone, which kind of makes it funnier. Now I want to rewatch it knowing that. And I went into this movie with very low expectations after the first one. I heard this one is better, but I didn't really expect such a fun movie as it is. So I was really pleasantly surprised by it. The beginning I didn't like it. The first time they showed like the first team in the movie, I kind of hated it. I thought, oh, this is even worse than the first one. Like it had a bunch of characters who are way too silly. Like I can't take it seriously. Like someone did touches his hands and his hands fly around in the air and moving the way he wants, and so all of that was kind of too silly. Like even in a cartoon that would be silly. So I didn't like it at first, but then it turns out that's not the actual Suicide Squad team. That was just a distraction. So basically they sent the worst possible superpowered criminals into that action, so to get rid of them and to cause a distraction. The only problem with that is that didn't they send that guy who was the leader of the team in the first movie, who is not a criminal, the one who is an actual soldier? So they send him to be sacrificed as well. So isn't that kind of strange? Like, why would you send someone who is actually loyal to you, who is not a criminal, that why is he also dispensable? So that didn't really make any sense. I guess maybe because he doesn't have powers and so they don't consider him so valuable, so they basically send him to be killed. Amanda Waller is basically an evil bitch, which in a way it is fun. There was also that scene in the end when she was planning to blow their heads off and she was screaming and all of that, so that was also really fun. But shouldn't she still be rational and smart? So why is she behaving so idiotically in so many places in the movie? Like, she's not really thinking straight, she's just been crazy, so it's a bit of a problem. I think it would have been more interesting if she actually had some kind of clever plan. So why the hell did she send that first team to the beach just to cause a distraction and sacrificed all those guys who are so-called useless, and yet they still have interesting powers that maybe in some situations would actually be very useful? So why sacrifice them just as a distraction? It doesn't really make sense, because the guy with the detachable arms, as silly as he is, it could be very useful in some situations, or just to study that scientifically, so why give that up? So it doesn't really make sense. And also the team that turns out to be the real team, they basically landed without resistance thanks to all of this, and yet later in the movie we see that they are actually capable of taking on whole armies without problem, so they didn't really need that help, they could have handled it. So why they need to sacrifice that first team, especially that one soldier who is actually a good guy? So why the hell to send him to be killed off without reason? Doesn't really make sense, even though he survived, and Harley Quinn was also in that first team, and she also survived somehow, and then there's a whole subplot of her falling in love with the ruler of this country, and they have like a love story which looks like it's all in her mind or something. It's kind of again over the top and crazy, but then it turns out to be actually real, so that was kind of funny. So a lot of crazy stuff in the movie. And I love the whole science fiction part in the end with that alien that they were studying that basically sends face huggers that take you over, which is an idea that was done in a lot of science fiction, but it was done really well here. Like, visually it looked great, it was funny, it was interesting, and they even added some moral shadiness, moral dilemmas in the end, even though it was a little bit kind of too one-sided, like trying to make the American government look evil, like oh, the Americans were all behind it all along, and all of that kind of stuff, which a lot of movies do. And I'm not against doing that, but I think it would be more interesting to show it as kind of a necessary evil kind of thing. That's the way it is in reality. I don't think anyone is doing anything just for the sake of being evil. Whenever some government is doing something, usually it has some kind of motive that would make sense, at least for the interest of that country, and so we could argue about it. It's like a moral shadiness, kind of a necessary evil, like I'm doing something nasty because my intentions are actually good, I'm planning something, and this is just a necessary stepping stone and so on. But in this movie it was kind of one-sided. Oh, they were just evil, they were basically like Nazi experiments without any actual purpose to it, and so I didn't like that. I think it's simply more interesting to show it how it is in reality, like it's a debate, it's something that is not just a one-sided debate, that is actually some kind of moral dilemma. That's always more interesting because we can debate it, we can talk about it, that's just something to think about. And I think it's okay to show like the moral ambiguity, like it's not black and white, there's not a good and bad side, instead it's some kind of necessary evil, and so that's much more complex and interesting and something to talk about, and yet this movie kind of treated it is just a black and white story. So what's the point of doing that? The only interesting thing about it is it's like a reverse of who you think is the good guy is actually the bad guy or whatever. So that's the only kind of interesting thing about it. But it's not really that interesting because it's still black and white in the end. And so you didn't really do anything except reverse the perception. And it's not very patriotic. This is an American movie. So why do American movies love to make their own country look bad in so many movies? That's kind of strange, I think. Just because you reverse the blame, but it's still one-sided blame, it's not that interesting. The only part I did like is that they kind of made the alien creature look like it's innocent at some point, that it's been abused, so it's not really evil, but then in the end it's still evil, it still wants to take over, and so that at least had some kind of hint that, this is not black and white, this is not good versus evil, it's more complex, and so I like that, but in the end it's still good versus evil, it's still a giant monster wants to destroy the city and take over humanity. So it's still simplistic in the end, but that will be totally fine. I'm not demanding that a movie like this have to be deep and thought-provoking. It's okay to just have a silly action movie. So it's not really a big complaint. It doesn't really ruin the movie for me. I just wanted to mention that and to discuss that topic a little bit of how the movie tries to pretend as if it's deeper than it actually is, when in the end it's not really that deep. So why even bother trying to make it complex and morally shady when you're not really doing that? And so a lot of that stuff was just convoluted for no real reason. The only interesting thing that came out of it is that it turned some of the characters in the Suicide Squad team against each other in the end, and so they were fighting each other for the so-called different views on the situation, and so that's the only kind of interesting thing that came out of that whole thing with the moral shadiness. And of course Amanda Waller being a crazy bitch in the end was entertaining to watch, but it doesn't really make any sense if you think about it. Why sacrifice soldiers who proved to be so useful just because they don't do exactly the way you want it, like you wanted something crazy and they don't agree and then you want to kill them? So that was a very entertaining scene, but doesn't really make sense. And also her own team betrays her, and then in the end there are no consequences, like someone hits her over the head so that she won't be able to blow the heads off of the heroes, and then there are no consequences to the ones who did that, so that makes no sense. And so a lot of things that are not perfect in this movie that I think could have been done better, but still a very entertaining movie, very enjoyable. Especially the humor was really good, the goriness and the special effects were done in an artistic, funny and fun way. So I really enjoyed this movie. It's not perfect, I wouldn't say it's a masterpiece, but it's a very fun movie. That's my opinion. Let me know what you think and we can discuss it all in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.